Paleopsychology is a term that was first used in the early 20th century by psychologists and psychiatrists in an attempt to link the way modern people thought to the way ancient people may have thought. This was done from an evolutionary perspective primarily, and specifically in their case as psychiatrists with an interest in mental illness. However, the term here will be resurrected and expanded to encompass varying degrees of cognition outside the survival instinct, the evolutionary impulses, and unleashed from the bounds of those explanatory constructs. Of course, physical survival is not the only type of survival. And released from that perspective, we open ourselves to windows into human development and motivations previously unexplored and unobserved. Typically, academics and specifically archaeologists and anthropologists that generally research ancient human activity are largely preoccupied with the origins of material civilization, buildings, artifacts. They make their deductions from migration patterns and agricultural developments. Paleopsychology, however, will introduce the major mystery of human civilization, that which separates us from every other known organism, or at least what we think separates us. Complex cognition. The interest here is the origins not of material civilization, but the dawn of modern thinking and the ways that our ancestors might have thought. In one sense, it's the opposite position that will be taken here, where civilization will not be thought to determine the way we think, but be a product of how we think. And this question is a bit of a chicken or the egg scenario. So we will explore concepts discluded, ignored from a lot of mainstream or more typical research into ancient human behavior, such as their intuitions and speculation, and assume that they had knowledge of their own minds, and to some degree had a theory of their own minds and spirituality. So first, let's briefly discuss how modern psychology discusses the framework of our minds. Typically, psychologists, cognitive psychologists, like myself, are interested largely in memory and the processes involved in memory. And memory is a general term that covers a lot of areas. So some of the ones I'm going to cover here are some of the more specified, specific cognitive structures or pathways in the model, some of the models of modern psychology. So broadly, memory is divided into two general classes, implicit and explicit memory. And those are basically terms that are almost synonymous with unconscious and conscious, slightly different, but loosely can be applied. And underneath those general categories, there are subcategories. Long-term memory and or explicit memory is typically divided into what's known as different types of long-term memories, things that you know. For instance, your name is an explicit memory. Where you were born. How to do a addition problem. How to spell the word crocodile. These are all bits of explicit knowledge or explicit memories. They are things that you could explain with words. Okay, so language is a good example that I'm going to use to bridge these two systems or these two deposits or repositories, explicit and implicit. And basically the idea is that these two categories are based on the types of information that we seem to process. And language is a great bridge for these two discrete types of knowledge. Things you can explain, like your name, where you live, and how to spell crocodile. Also, the language that you speak, what that language is called, the knowledge that you know a language. These are all explicit pieces of information. However, learning that language was done implicitly. And what that means, and this gets a little bit more mysterious, explicit knowledge is very easy to understand because we all know we know it and we know what we don't know, or in a sense, it's easy to observe the knowledge we know. It's not very easy to observe the knowledge we don't know. So implicit knowledge is the types of things that we're not necessarily aware of. And there's different types of implicit knowledge, implicit memories. And these systems are also processes. So learning a language was done underneath your radar, without awareness, without full awareness. It was done essentially through what's called, in conversational terms, osmosis. But it's done through just essentially atmospheric exposure, environmental exposure, being in the area of that language being spoken. The syntax, the rules, the definitions for the words that we use are largely known and recognized before we can use them. So language is a great example of implicit learning and implicit knowledge. Now, these categories are generally considered to be the model of how we discuss our minds in academic psychology. And you could investigate this further. There's no shortage of research on these models, or this model, these categories. So long and short-term memory, explicit and implicit memory. These are all different types of categories that are discussed. Now we're going to focus on, or what I'm going to focus on, are the more implicit more unconscious types of knowledge acquisition and information. Things we're not really aware that we know, and we don't necessarily remember learning. So some of those are motor skills. We sometimes loosely call those types of things muscle memory. For instance, you could never explain to somebody with words exactly how you swim or exactly how you throw a curveball or exactly how you walk or walk on a tightrope or ride a bicycle. Could never fully explain that with a book. Has to be done through trial and error. You have to learn by doing it. And that's a bit of implicit learning. That knowledge, that knowing how to do it, is really something that you're aware that you know, but you can't articulate through language. It's either done through showing or it's done through other people having guidance and trying it out for themselves. So some implicit understanding is motor skills. And instinct is not implicit knowledge. For instance, chewing or breathing. Involuntary biological processes are not implicit knowledge. So genetic information would not be considered implicit knowledge. It's not knowledge necessarily, it's part of our genetic imprint. It's not acquired. So what types of knowledge are acquired under our full conscious awareness? Those are the things that are of intense interest to a lot of psychology, both mainstream and esoteric. And always has been from the beginning, with some of the more well-known psychiatrists and researchers like Freud and Carl Jung and those types. Even the more off the or out of the public general academics psychology. One of the ones I'm going to talk about is Gestalt psychology, because they are it is a holistic theory. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus in this framework that I'm proposing on unconscious activity primarily. And one of the ways that I'm going to discuss that is first by discussing the different processes. So holistic and analytic information processing. So it's almost just like there is a conscious and unconscious type of information, learning, cognition, storage, retrieval, all of it, both done consciously and unconsciously. We can also process information two different ways, either analytically or holistically. So either we do it piecemeal, from the details into a big picture, or we process thing all at once and then basically try to figure out what it is we're looking at post hoc. So we notice the details secondly. Gestalt psychology is one of the school frameworks that offers a holistic theory of processing. And one of the interesting ways we can think about this is how we process the human face. And it's thought, and there's a lot of research to suggest, that we process faces holistically, very differently than we process a lot of other objects and things. And the theory, the reasoning is that the human face is so important to human beings that we have a specific, separate, and dedicated cognitive pathway devoted specifically for processing and storing human faces. And the processing of faces is thought to be done holistically, not analytically. One of the types of ways we can observe this holistic face processing or holistic processing of faces are things like pareidolia. Now, pareidolia is a human information processing bias that tends to interpret stimuli in the visual field that resemble the patterns of a human face as a face. Like this image, like any image, wood grain, even emojis essentially are examples of pareidolia. So sometimes people use this term a bit improperly as a derogatory or insult, derogatory remark or some sort of insult by saying you have pareidolia. And essentially I think what they mean is that you don't know that what you're looking at is not created by a person, in the sense that we have things like the Mars face, or sometimes artifacts that people think might look like faces and other people might think are not done by humans and they're natural. So there's some controversy about a lot of this, like the Mars face. Is it a structure made by some race or species or people that was meant to look like a face, or is it just a bunch of terrain that happens to look like a face? So this is an example of pareidolia where it clearly looks like a face, and everybody will say, I mean, it has to look like a face to a person, just like these look like faces to people, and just like these look like faces to people. So pareidolia is a simple cognitive bias that firstly interprets patterns in the environment that look like a face as a face, and then post hoc you realize that, oh, it's not actually a face, it's a bunch of stuff that it's an optical illusion in this case, or in this case, we know these are emojis, and then we interpret what it is that we're looking at. But the initial wave, the initial very quick, and this happens in a few milliseconds, the first visual processing happens in about 2 or 3 milliseconds. It sits, and then you notice that something's waiting to be processed, and then you start to process what exactly it is. Oh, it's an emoji. But first your mind's thinking face, and then your brain's thinking face, and then your psychological mind, your rational mind comes in and interprets exactly what it is. And that's sort of the process involved with holistic processing, where first patterns, detectable common patterns, have an already existing category for them that activates another cascade of cues, in this case, face. So pareidolia is what that process is called. So saying that somebody has pareidolia is kind of using it improperly, because we all have it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see a face in an emoji, or you wouldn't be able to recognize things like this, like puzzles and games as faces, and even cartoon characters. So this idea is an example of holistic face processing, because things that look like it are initially processed as face. So that doesn't happen with other objects, and I'm sure you can observe in yourself. Things that look like other things aren't immediately processed first as that. Not as powerfully as they are with things that look like human faces. Another example that's used by psychologists to show this idea that we do process faces holistically and differently than other objects is what's called the Thatcher illusion. And this is another cognitive bias that shows that we process faces all at once, not necessarily recognizing the small details until after the fact, if at all sometimes. And this example here, called the Thatcher illusion, shows that. And what actually is going on here, if you look at the picture on the left, it's Margaret Thatcher. Above this is that same image upside down. Now, the Thatcher illusion occurs when you show somebody an image of Margaret Thatcher like this one, and people generally, and you might not notice, maybe you know this concept or this research, but you're primed a little bit because we're discussing it. So you might notice in this that there's some oddities, the mouth and the eyes, and maybe you don't. And that is the Thatcher illusion, that people generally will not notice the mutations in an upside down face. This is actually the face that I showed you just now. So the fact that we don't notice those issues, those problems with the face, is a psychological evidence that we process it all at once, holistically, not piecemeal from the details, and then assemble an interpretation from the details up or from the bottom up. It's a top-down processing system. All at once face, and then you start to maybe notice the little oddities. Oh, something's wrong there. And then you might notice. And in the everyday world, you might have that perception as you might notice the face, and then you start to notice that, oh, the person has freckles and they might have pretty eyes or something. But first, it's just face or something like that. So that's the psychological theory behind this idea of holistic facial processing. So pareidolia and the Thatcher illusion are two good examples of this idea of an implicit system that's very powerful in human beings, like recognizing a human face. That's so powerful that it often misfires sometimes when things just resemble it, because it's such a critical element of our minds. Okay, so it often misfires because in the idea of an evolutionary perspective, it's much better to have false negatives or false positives than it's much better to have an overactive facial detection system than an underactive facial detection system. It's better to err on the side of caution evolutionarily in this particular case with recognizing potential friends or enemies as far as humans go. So that's the psychological theory on why this sort of difference exists in the way we process faces compared to the way we seem to process most other types of information. Facial information compared to other types of information. So two of the main categories that I am going to talk about again are the conscious and the unconscious. And I am going to use a framework of the implicit and explicit system as represented inside a model that I constructed using this diagram.